everybody. My name is Melissa Wilcox. I teach at the University of California, Riverside, on the occupied homelands of the Cahuilla, Tongva, Wisseño, and Serrano peoples. I work in the Religious Studies department, and I'm a scholar of religion, primarily in the US. I study religion and power. And one of the things that I want to talk about today is stories. I want to talk about stories about history and stories about religion, and the ways that how we tell those stories actually changes how we understand the world around us, who we think belongs, why we think they belong, who we think doesn't, and so on. So let me start. If I'm going to talk about the story of the history of religion in the US, I have to talk about those two words, right? So let's start with religion. A lot of people take the word religion for granted. We know what it is. Usually when you ask people in the US to define religion, you end up with something having to do with belief and God. Problem is, you go a little ways outside of the US, or you go to other communities in the US, and pretty soon you find out that there are some religions that don't have God, some religions where belief isn't that important. So how come we can't really come up with a definition of religion? Well, the reason is that the concept of religion as we understand it today, that we might define as something like a shared aspect of all human cultures that is similar enough that we can identify it in every human culture and compare it. That idea of religion actually just originated a few hundred years ago. It started as a way of thinking about how Protestants and Catholics might be more alike than different, and maybe they should stop killing each other. Pretty soon, it got extended to Judaism. That also got to be called a religion, along with Christianity. But everybody else in the world didn't have a religion. Over time, the concept's been extended more and more, till now we have the concept of world religions as basically aspects of different world cultures that we can identify, that we can compare. What are the beliefs of this religion, this religion, this religion? What are the sacred texts of this religion, this religion? What are the deities? What are the spirits? And so on. The way that this concept was used shortly after it was invented, really all the way up to today, is to define those who have religion and those who haven't. And depending on whether we think religion is good or bad, those people get defined in or out of goodness, of culture, of society. So when religion was something that good people, that evolved people had, let's put that all in scare quotes, right? Then people that didn't have religion, and particularly if part of the definition of religion meant having a sacred text, people whose histories and traditions were oral, all of those were superstitions. Those were not considered evolved. Those were not considered advanced. And so guess what? That became a really important justification. Important as in it was useful, not important as in it should be meaningful today. That became a really important justification for colonization. Hey, these people don't really have a religion, quote unquote, so let's bring our religion to them, and along with that, let's bring our culture because we think that maybe they should be, quote unquote, civilized. This becomes an excuse for European colonization around the world, and certainly in the United States. And as a matter of fact, arguments about Native people not having, quote unquote, religion became a part of the institution of the boarding schools that were particularly strong in the 19th and 20th century, in which children were essentially kidnapped from their tribes, punished for practicing their traditional life ways, punished for speaking their traditional languages, and essentially forced into a European and Christian model of being. So the word religion is really complicated, and it has a lot of meanings that go way beyond something simple like, what is this religion and what does it teach? Today, sometimes the word religion is good. For other people, the word religion is bad because it means institutions and controlling your thoughts, and spirituality is a good word. So again, we have to think about who we call religious, what we call a religion, and what kinds of judgments does that statement carry when we say it or when we hear it. Second piece, history. When you ask people to tell the story of US history, or you ask them where it starts, almost everybody says with the Puritans. Now, those of us over here on the West Coast are kind of like, so when do we get to start into the history? Because think about it, anytime you tell a story, you have to have a starting point. And the starting point you choose shapes what story you're going to tell. History isn't just absent until something happens. So how do we tell the story of the lands that are currently controlled by the United States? Well, now when you frame it that way, it's not just the contiguous 48 states, it's Alaska, it's Hawaii, it's all of the other territories that are considered part of the United States but don't have voting rights. Why are those territories not in the story of the history? Why does the history start with the East Coast? Easy answer, oh, well, it's because of the Puritans. It's because those were the first people to colonize. Wait a minute, the Spanish were here first. So automatically when we start telling the story, we have to think about whose history are we telling? You often hear people say, this is a nation of immigrants. Well, this is a nation of Native people too. And when we say this is a nation of immigrants, we ignore that particularly many of the people who came for the first several centuries came with guns. This is also a nation of colonizers. This is also a nation of invaders. Not everyone who immigrated, quote unquote, came here by their own will. Many people came here as a part of the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade. So again, when we talk about being a nation of immigrants, we're telling a story that's too simple, and we're also telling a story that doesn't include everyone. When we talk about US history and religion, again, we start with Christianity, and yet there were hundreds of different traditional lifeways, things that if we take a broad definition of religion, we would understand as religion today, things that many people understand as religion or spirituality today. So when we tell the story of US religious history and we start with Christianity, we also erase all of those indigenous lifeways, many of which were intentionally erased by the process of colonization and the process of Christianization. Many of them have survived, many of them are being strengthened today as people gain more and more ability to recover, support, and develop their traditional lifeways again. Those were banned, by the way, in the late 19th and early 20th century. Oh wait, we have a First Amendment. The government isn't supposed to say anything about religion. Remember that definition? So native traditions were not defined as religion. That was an easy way to get away with banning them. As we tell the history then, we also tell histories about religion in Black communities having only to do with Christianity. We miss the fact that there have been Muslims in the lands that are now controlled by the United States for hundreds of years, because some of the people that were brought across in the Middle Passage were Muslim. We miss the fact that there have been Jews since the 17th century on the lands that are now called the United States. Many of them escaped from Brazil when Brazil took on the Portuguese ban on Jews and Muslims. So this is not just a story about diversity, though. This is not a story about pluralism. This is a story about who appears in our histories and who is erased. As someone who was raised in California, I learned a version of California history that we would call, as scholars, supersessionist. Because the story started with Native people. And then the Spanish arrived, and the Native people disappeared, and there were no more Native people in the story. This is how settler colonialism works. If you erase the Native people from the story, then the land looks empty. And all of a sudden, you don't have to think about the fact that you're living on occupied land. After the Spanish, we have the illegal annexation of northern Mexico, which was, of course, not taught to me that way. And the Spanish disappear, and now California is entirely white, even though California was, at that point in the mid-19th century, a mixture of Native people, of Spanish people, of white and Black, and increasingly Asian, not just East Asian, but also by the late 19th century, South Asian. Again, this is not a story about pluralism, it's a story about erasure. So what's the takeaway as I reach the end of my 10 minutes? Think about the stories you're told. Ask questions about the stories you're told. Ask questions about stories about religion, what they mean. What does it mean when somebody says those people are religious? They're too religious, or it's great that they're religious, or they're not religious enough. There is power in the stories we tell. Thanks.